The notoriety from the silent orchestra case had brought a fresh wave of clients to our door, most of whom presented puzzles of such a trivial nature that Holmes grew increasingly weary. He was on the verge of declaring a moratorium on all new cases when a hansom cab deposited a man who was the very antithesis of triviality. He was Mr. J. Abernathy, a senior solicitor, a man built of sharp angles and grey tweed, whose face was a mask of professional gravity. "Mr. Holmes," he began, taking the seat offered to him, "I am here on behalf of a new client. The client, I must confess, is deceased." Holmes leaned forward, his interest instantly piqued. A posthumous client? The very best kind. They are rarely able to obscure the facts. Pray, continue. "My firm represents the estate of the late industrialist, Mr. Alaric Blackwood," the solicitor explained. "As you may have read in the morning papers, Mr. Blackwood was found dead yesterday morning. The police have ruled it a suicide, and on the surface, the facts are unshakable." He laid out the puzzle with a lawyer's precision. Alaric Blackwood was a recluse, a man obsessed with security. His sanctum sanctorum was a state-of-the-art, bank-style vault in the basement of his mansion, built to house his collection of rare manuscripts. It had a single, massive steel door, controlled by a complex time lock. Crucially, it was also secured by two heavy steel bolts that could only be operated from the inside. "Yesterday morning," Abernathy continued, "the time lock expired at its designated hour. The butler, concerned that his master had not emerged, opened the heavy door. He found Lord Blackwood inside, dead from cyanide poisoning. And the two internal bolts, Mr. Holmes, were firmly shot home. Locked. From the inside." "An open and shut case of suicide," I remarked. "Precisely what the police concluded," Abernathy agreed. "Except for this." He produced a sealed envelope from his briefcase. "It is an addendum to Mr. Blackwood's will, delivered to my office by his own hand a week ago, with instructions to open it only upon his death. It contains a single, chilling directive." He passed the letter to Holmes. I read it over his shoulder. It said, "In the event of my death, particularly if circumstances suggest I have taken my own life, my executors are instructed to disregard the official findings and to engage, at any cost, the services of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For I shall not die by my own hand, but by the machinations of an enemy who can walk through steel." Holmes lowered the letter, his eyes blazing with a fierce, intellectual fire I had not seen in weeks. A voice from the grave. "Watson. A client who hires us to solve his own murder, a murder committed in a room that no one could have entered or exited." He stood, grabbing his coat. "The world is full of obvious things, and I suspect we shall find a great many have been overlooked in that sealed tomb. To the Blackwood estate at once." The Blackwood mansion was a gloomy, neo-Gothic pile of stone in the heart of Mayfair, its windows like vacant eyes. It was a house that seemed to be holding its breath. The butler, a tall, gaunt man named Fleming with a face etched by years of silent service, led us down a winding stone staircase into the basement. The air grew cold, and the silence became absolute. We stood before the vault. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a testament to Alaric Blackwood's paranoia. The steel door was a foot thick, its surface gleaming under the gaslight. The frame was set seamlessly into the solid bedrock of the house. Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, a man with more diligence than imagination, was waiting for us. "Holmes," he greeted, "a waste of your time. I've been over it a dozen times. The facts are solid. The door was time-locked until 8 a.m. The internal bolts were shot. The only key to the time lock was on the ring in the dead man's pocket. The ventilation system is a closed loop. Its grates are welded from the inside. A fly couldn't get in or out of that room. He locked himself in and took the poison." Holmes ignored Gregson, his attention fixed on the vault itself. He ran his fingers over the immense steel door, the complex dials of the time lock, the flawlessly sealed edges. He produced his lens and examined the floor in front of the door, a pristine expanse of polished stone. "You have had the body removed?" Holmes asked. "To the mortuary, yes," Gregson confirmed. "Found him in his armchair, a glass with the residue of potassium cyanide on the table beside him. Open and shut." "Did you find anything else in the room?" Gregson shrugged. "A collection of old books, a desk, an armchair, a carafe of water, and this." He gestured to a small table near the vault's entrance, upon which an evidence bag lay. Inside was a single, peculiar object, a small, exquisitely carved wooden canary, its painted yellow feathers startlingly bright against the grim backdrop. It was on the floor, near the door, Gregson explained. Presumably just a decorative trinket that fell from his desk. Means nothing. Holmes picked up the bag, his eyes narrowing as he studied the small bird. He did not look at it as a simple trinket. He examined the precision of its carving, the specific species of bird it represented, the way its tiny, painted eyes seemed to watch him. He turned it over, noting the flat, uncarved base. Nothing is ever nothing, Inspector, Holmes murmured, a strange, thoughtful light in his eyes. Every object in a sealed room is a potential witness. And this one, he said, holding up the bag, sings a most unusual song. The game had begun, and its opening move was a silent, wooden bird found in a hermetically sealed tomb. A man who fears being murdered does not typically surround himself with friends, Holmes remarked as we ascended the cold stone steps from the vault. Mr. Abernathy, I must speak with the beneficiaries of Mr. Blackwood's will. The solicitor led us to a grand, dusheet drawing room where the three primary heirs were waiting, an uncomfortable trinity of suspicion and barely concealed avarice. First, there was Julian Blackwood, the deceased's younger nephew. He was a handsome, rakish man in his late 20s, with an easy charm that failed to mask the calculating glint in his eyes. His fine clothes were slightly frayed, the mark of a man living beyond his means. Alaric Blackwood, who despised his nephew's frivolous lifestyle, had kept him on a notoriously tight allowance. Next was Eleanor Vance, Alaric's niece, a severe, plainly dressed woman in her 40s. She was a devout and zealous supporter of various social purity campaigns. She openly disapproved of her uncle's vast collection of what she considered blasphemous and decadent medieval manuscripts, believing the money would be better spent on saving the city's soul. There was a cold, fanatical fire in her eyes. Finally, seated apart from the others, was Dr. Alistair Finch. I was startled to see him again, the surgeon whom Holmes had saved from the poet of death. Abernathy quietly explained that Dr. Finch was not family, but had been Alaric Blackwood's personal physician and closest confidant for over a decade. He was named as the executor of the will and the beneficiary of a significant trust, intended to fund a new hospital wing. Holmes addressed the room. I am investigating the circumstances of Mr. Blackwood's death, which he himself believed would be a murder. Preposterous. Julian scoffed. Uncle Alaric was a paranoid eccentric. He saw assassins in every shadow. He simply lost his nerve and took the easy way out. Suicide is the path of a soul in despair, Eleanor Vance intoned, her voice cold and judgmental. My uncle turned his back on salvation. His end was his own making. Only Dr. Finch seemed to take the matter seriously. I must confess, I too dismissed Alaric's fears, he said, his voice heavy with a physician's solemn gravity. He suffered from delusions of persecution. I prescribe him sedatives for his anxiety. But his letter to you, it is deeply unsettling. To lock himself in and then be murdered. The very idea defies all logic. 3 individuals, each with a clear motive, debt, ideology, and perhaps a hidden professional secret. And one of them, a man of science and logic, was the only one who truly understood the victim's state of mind. Holmes listened to them all, his face an impassive mask, but I could see the wheels of his mind turning, assessing the subtle discords in their carefully composed testimonies. Holmes, having listened to the heirs, turned his attention to the one man who had been a constant, silent presence in Alaric Blackwood's reclusive life, the butler, Fleming. We found him in the dimly lit pantry, polishing silver with a slow, methodical rhythm that seemed undisturbed by the recent tragedy. You served Mr. Blackwood for a long time, Fleming, Holmes began, his voice soft, almost conversational. 35 years, sir, the butler replied, his voice a dry, rustling whisper, not looking up from his work. From the day he inherited this house until the end. He was a man of routine, I gather. Unyielding routine, sir, Fleming confirmed. Breakfast at 7. Study from 8 until noon. A light lunch. The afternoon with his manuscripts. Dinner at 6. And at precisely 8 o'clock every evening, he would descend to the vault. The time lock would be set for 8 o'clock the following morning. No one was to disturb him. And the night he died. Holmes pressed. Was there any deviation, any break in this unyielding routine? The butler paused his polishing, a flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps, in his downcast eyes. No, sir. Everything was as it always was. The answer was too quick, too final. Holmes, sensing the subtle facet, shifted his line of attack. "Tell me about the wooden canary we found. A curious object for a man like Mr. Blackwood." Fleming's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "A sentimental trinket, sir. From his childhood." "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice hardening slightly. "Now, Fleming, I will ask you again. Was there anything, no matter how small, that was different about the night he died?" The butler placed his polishing cloth down. He seemed to be wrestling with a long-held sense of duty. "There was one thing," he admitted at last, his voice barely audible. "A break in routine, not that night, but for the past month. Mr. Blackwood developed a new habit." "Go on," Holmes urged. "Every evening, for the past month, after his dinner but before he descended to the vault, he would take a short walk in the garden. Alone. For precisely 15 minutes. He had never done so before in all his 35 years of service. He said the fresh air cleared his head. On the night he died, he took his usual walk. He returned at 5 minutes to 8, and went directly to the vault. That was the last time I saw him alive." A new habit. A 15-minute window. To anyone else, it was a trivial detail. But to Holmes, a sudden, inexplicable break in a lifetime of rigid routine was a screaming anomaly. It was a crack in the foundation of the case, and he knew, with an instinct honed over hundreds of cases, that the truth of the impossible murder lay somewhere within that 15-minute stroll in the dark, lonely garden. The garden behind the Blackwood mansion was a neglected, melancholy place, its paths overgrown, its once manicured flower beds surrendering to weeds. A high stone wall, topped with jagged, broken glass, enclosed the entire property, ensuring absolute privacy. Holmes, with Fleming's testimony echoing in his mind, insisted on examining the path of Alaric Blackwood's newfound evening constitutional. We followed the faint trail from a side door, across a damp, mossy lawn, to a small, crumbling gazebo at the far end of the garden. 15 minutes, Watson, Holmes mused, his eyes scanning the ground, the walls, the overgrown foliage. Not a long time. Just long enough for a breath of fresh air, as he claimed. Or, just long enough for a brief, clandestine meeting. He walked the perimeter of the garden, his gaze fixed on the high stone wall. Impenetrable for the most part, he observed. Then he stopped. He pointed to a section of the wall that was almost completely obscured by a thick, ancient curtain of ivy. "Look here," he said, parting the dense leaves. Behind the ivy, the wall was subtly different. A small, arched section of stonework, no more than 4 feet high, seemed newer than the surrounding masonry. At its base, almost completely hidden by moss, was a small, iron ring. Holmes grasped it and pulled. With a low groan of rusted metal, a small, heavy door, cleverly disguised as part of the wall, swung inwards, revealing a dark, narrow passage leading out into a quiet mews behind the mansion. "A priest's hole," Holmes breathed, a look of triumph on his face. A secret entrance, a relic from a more turbulent time, unknown to the staff, perhaps even to the rest of the family. This was not a walk for fresh air, Watson. This was a rendezvous. He knelt, examining the ground just inside the secret door. The earth here was soft and damp. He produced his lens and pointed to a series of faint impressions. "Footprints," he stated. 2 sets. One, a man's large boot, consistent with Mr. Blackwood's. The other is smaller, more delicate, with a distinctly pointed heel. A lady's shoe. He then picked up a tiny object from the mud, something that glittered faintly in the gloom. It was a single, iridescent blue sequin, the kind used in elaborate evening gowns. "So," Holmes said, rising and holding up the sequin, "our reclusive, paranoid Mr. Blackwood, for the final month of his life, was having a secret nightly meeting with a woman of fashion and high society, a woman who was, it appears, the very last person to see him alive before he entered his tomb. The mystery of the sealed vault had just acquired a new, an entirely unexpected, player, a secret lover, or perhaps, a secret enemy. The discovery of the secret meetings and the telltale sequin sent Holmes on a hunt not for a phantom who could walk through walls, but for a woman of flesh and blood. A blue sequin from an evening gown, Watson, he declared back at Baker Street, surrounded by his formidable collection of society pages and gossip columns. This is not the mark of a common woman. This is the calling card of someone who moves in the higher circles, someone who attends the balls and soirees of the London season. For 2 days, Holmes became a master of high society intelligence. He cross-referenced lists of guests from recent galas, corresponded with couturiers, and dispatched his network of street urchins, the Baker Street irregulars, to the mews behind the Blackwood mansion with instructions to listen for any whispers of a mysterious, well-dressed visitor. The breakthrough came from a most unexpected source, a small, almost hidden, item in the Tatler. It was a brief mention of a charity concert held a month prior, praising the dazzling sapphire blue gown worn by one of the event's patrons. Holmes cross-referenced the name with his knowledge of the Blackwood circle, and a look of profound understanding crossed his face. "Of course," he breathed. "The one person we never thought to question about their personal life. The one person who presented a facade of cold, unimpeachable piety." "You don't mean—" I began, utterly astonished. "Yes, Watson," Holmes confirmed, his eyes gleaming. "The woman who met Alaric Blackwood in secret, the owner of the blue sequin, was none other than his own niece, the zealous, puritanical Miss Eleanor Vance." The revelation was staggering. The woman who publicly condemned her uncle's decadent lifestyle was secretly meeting him in the dead of night. Her motive, which had seemed so clear-cut and ideological, a desire to see his fortune redirected to her charities, was now revealed to be a lie, a carefully constructed mask to hide a far more complex and personal relationship. "We have been looking at her as a suspect in a crime of ideology," Holmes stated, his voice a low, intense hum. "We must now look at her as a suspect in a crime of passion. And that, my dear Watson, is a far more dangerous and unpredictable creature." We had found the woman in blue, and in doing so, had unlocked a whole new, hidden chamber in the heart of the mystery. Armed with this startling new knowledge, we paid a second visit to the Blackwood mansion. We found Eleanor Vance in the library, poring over the ledgers of one of her charitable societies. She looked up as we entered, her face a mask of cold, pious composure. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "I trust you are making progress, and not merely wasting my late uncle's money on fanciful theories." "On the contrary, Miss Vance," Holmes replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "We have made a most significant discovery. We have learned that your uncle, in the final month of his life, was not the complete recluse he appeared to be. He was, in fact, engaged in a series of secret, nightly rendezvous." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "We found a secret door in the garden wall, and a single, rather beautiful, blue sequin." If I had expected a dramatic reaction, I was mistaken. Eleanor Vance did not gasp or faint. Instead, a slow, deep blush rose from her neck, coloring her pale cheeks. She closed her ledger, her hands perfectly steady. "You are a clever man, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low, but unwavering. "It is true. I was that woman. You, who so publicly condemned his lifestyle." I blurted out, unable to contain my surprise. "My public position and my private duties are two different things, Doctor," she replied, her gaze now defiant. "My uncle was a troubled man. He was lonely. He reached out to me, his only living relative with whom he felt he could speak. He was consumed by fear, by paranoia. He believed someone was trying to kill him. I met with him to offer spiritual comfort, to pray with him, to urge him to abandon his decadent life and seek solace in faith." "A noble cause," Holmes observed, his voice neutral. "And did your spiritual comfort extend to the night he died?" "Yes," she confirmed without hesitation. "I met him in the garden, as was our custom. He was more agitated than ever. He spoke of an enemy who was closing in. He gave me this." She reached into her handbag and produced a small, leather-bound diary. "It is his private journal. He told me that if anything should happen to him, this would explain everything. He made me swear to give it to the authorities. After our meeting, I watched him walk back to the house and descend to the vault. I am the last person who saw him alive." Her story was a masterpiece of righteous conviction. She had taken a damning set of facts, a secret affair, a final meeting, and reframed them as an act of piety. The zealous niece had not been a secret lover, but a secret savior. She had a perfect, unshakable explanation for her presence. But as she handed the diary to Holmes, I saw a flicker of triumph in her cold, clear eyes. And I knew, with a sudden chill, that we were being masterfully played. Holmes accepted the small leather diary from Eleanor Vance's outstretched hand. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he held it to his nose, taking a long, thoughtful sniff of the leather binding. He then produced his lens and examined the metal clasp with meticulous care. "You say your uncle gave you this on the night he died?" Holmes asked, his eyes still fixed on the small object. "He did," Eleanor confirmed, a note of sanctimonious pride in her voice. "He entrusted it to me, knowing I alone could be trusted to see his final wishes carried out." "And you have kept it on your person ever since?" "Of course. It has not left my handbag." Holmes nodded slowly. He carefully placed the diary, not in his pocket, but into a large, oilskin evidence pouch he carried for such occasions. "Thank you, Miss Vance. You have been most forthcoming." As we walked away from the gloomy mansion, my mind was racing. A diary, Holmes. The case is solved. Blackwood must have named his enemy within its pages. "On the contrary, Watson," Holmes replied, his expression unusually grim as he stared at the pouch in his hand. "The case has just become infinitely more dangerous. I fear this diary was not meant to be read." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Did you not notice the smell?" he countered. "A faint, but distinct, scent of bitter almonds clinging to the leather. The classic aroma of cyanide. And the clasp, it was not made of brass or steel, but of a softer, duller metal. Lead, Watson, which has been treated with an acidic agent to create a fine, powdery residue of lead acetate." My blood ran cold as the diabolical ingenuity of the plot became clear. Good heavens, Holmes, a poison trap. "Precisely," he confirmed, his voice a low, angry hum. "A twofold trap. The clasp is coated with a contact poison, the lead acetate. Anyone who handles it extensively would fall ill over time. But the true danger is the leather itself. It has been impregnated with a volatile cyanide compound. The intention was not for the recipient to fall ill, but to do what any curious person would do, hold the diary to their face, to sniff the old leather, or perhaps even kiss it in a moment of sentiment. A single, deep inhalation would be fatal. So Eleanor Vance is either a fool of the highest order, or a murderess of unparalleled cunning," Holmes finished. "She has handed us a piece of evidence that, had we been less cautious, would have made us the killer's next victims. The question is, was she the intended author of this trap, or merely its unwitting messenger?" The diary, which had promised answers, had instead delivered a direct and deadly threat. The discovery of the poisoned diary sent a chill through the investigation. It was a clear act of premeditated murder, aimed not at the original victim, but at the investigators themselves. "This changes the psychological profile of our killer entirely, Watson," Holmes declared, after safely neutralizing the diary in a chemical bath back at Baker Street. "This is not a crime of passion. This is the cold, calculated work of a mind that is both patient and utterly ruthless. Let us re-examine our remaining suspects in this new, unforgiving light." His focus turned first to the rakish nephew, Julian Blackwood. If Eleanor's story was a lie, then Julian's motive, desperate debt, became primary once more. We found him at his club, playing cards with a confidence that suggested his financial woes were soon to be over. "A poisoned book, Mr. Holmes," he said with a cynical laugh when Holmes confronted him. "Sounds like something out of a melodrama. A clever trick, I'll grant you, but far too subtle for my tastes. Besides," he added, leaning back in his chair, "my alibi for the time of my uncle's death is perfectly sound. I was here, at this very card table, from 9 o'clock in the evening until 2 in the morning. Ask any of the 4 gentlemen present. They will confirm it." He was smug, confident, and seemingly untouchable. Frustrated, Holmes's attention then turned to the one man with the scientific knowledge to create such a diabolical trap, Dr. Alistair Finch. We visited him at his Harley Street practice, a place of sterile order and quiet authority. Holmes presented the neutralized diary to the doctor. "As a man of science, Doctor, what do you make of this?" Dr. Finch examined the diary with a professional, detached air. He confirmed Holmes's analysis of the poisons. "A sophisticated, if gruesome, mechanism," he commented, his voice a low, clinical murmur. "The use of lead acetate as a transdermal agent is particularly cunning. It would require a considerable knowledge of toxicology. A knowledge that a prominent surgeon such as yourself would possess," Holmes pointed out. Dr. Finch did not flinch. He looked directly at Holmes, his expression one of solemn gravity. "Of course. Just as I would have the knowledge to set a bone, or diagnose a fever. But knowledge, Mr. Holmes, is not motive. Alaric Blackwood was my patient, and my friend. I stood to gain nothing from his death but the administrative burden of executing his will and the sorrow of losing a companion. He was the perfect picture of professional integrity. He had the knowledge, but he possessed an ironclad alibi of his own, a complete lack of any discernible motive. The path to the truth was once again blocked. On one hand, a man with a powerful motive but a solid alibi. On the other, a man with the perfect knowledge but no motive at all. It was a perfect, maddening equilibrium. The investigation had reached a state of perfect, frustrating paralysis. We were trapped in a logical paradox. "Consider the pieces, Watson," Holmes said, pacing the floor of 221B like a caged wolf. "We have 3 primary suspects, each locked in a cage of contradictions." "Eleanor Vance, the zealot," he began, ticking a finger in the air. "She had the opportunity. She was the last to see Blackwood alive. She delivered the murder weapon, the poisoned diary. But her motive, as she presents it, is one of piety, not murder. Is she a master manipulator or a naive pawn?" "Julian Blackwood, the debtor," he continued. "He has the strongest, most traditional motive, a fortune waiting to be inherited. But he is protected by an alibi of 4 witnesses. Is his alibi genuine, or was it purchased with the promise of future wealth? And Dr. Finch, the physician," he concluded. "He possesses the unique scientific knowledge required to create the poison trap. He was Blackwood's confidant, a man who understood his fears and his routines. But he has no discernible motive whatsoever. Is he a grieving friend, or a wolf in sheep's clothing?" "Every path we take leads to a brick wall," I lamented. "Precisely," Holmes agreed, coming to a halt before the fireplace. "And that is because we are trying to solve 3 separate puzzles. We must find the single, unifying thread that connects them all. The secret of the garden meeting, the mystery of the sealed vault, and the riddle of the poisoned diary are not 3 different stories. They are 3 acts of the same, dark play." He fell silent, his eyes taking on a distant, unfocused glaze. The familiar signs were all there. He was disengaging from the world of foggy London streets and confusing testimonies. He was preparing to journey into a landscape far clearer, and far more revealing. "I must be alone, Watson," he said, his voice a low murmur. He sank into his armchair, steepled his fingers, and closed his eyes. "There is an anomaly, a detail I have observed but not yet understood. I must find it. I am retreating to my palace." The hunt in the physical world was over. The hunt within the mind was about to begin. I sat in the profound silence of our rooms, watching as Holmes, though motionless, embarked on the most crucial journey of the investigation. He was walking the vast corridors of his mind palace, revisiting every scene, re-examining every piece of evidence. In his mind, he stood once more in the cold, oppressive vault. He saw the massive, bolted steel door. He saw the body in the chair. He saw the small, brightly painted wooden canary on the floor. He had dismissed it as a trinket, a piece of sentiment. But now, in the silence of his mind, he looked closer. He saw not just a bird, but a canary. A bird famous for one specific, grim purpose. A sentinel, used by miners to detect invisible, poisonous gases. A symbol of warning, his mind catalogued. He moved to another chamber of his palace, the secret garden. He replayed the scene of his interview with Eleanor Vance. He heard her sanctimonious voice, explaining her pious visits. He saw her hand him the diary. But this time, he focused on a detail he had subconsciously registered but failed to appreciate. He saw her handbag. It was made of fine, expensive leather, but on the clasp, there was a tiny, almost invisible scratch, a small fleck of, what? Blue paint. Not the deep sapphire of a sequin, but a brighter, more vibrant azure. Next, he found himself in the card room of Julian Blackwood's club. He saw the rakish nephew, laughing with his friends, his alibi seemingly unshakable. But Holmes re-examined the memory not of Julian, but of the table itself. He saw the cards, the brandy glasses, the overflowing ashtray. And in that ashtray, amongst the cigarette butts, he saw a single, half-smoked, and very distinctive cheroot, a brand he knew to be a cheap, dockside cigar, utterly out of place amongst the expensive cigarettes of the club's gentlemen members. One of Julian's alibi witnesses, it seemed, had a taste for cheap tobacco. Finally, he stood in Dr. Finch's pristine Harley Street office. He heard the doctor's calm, logical explanation of the poison. But he looked past the man and examined the room. It was a monument to medical science, every object in its place. except one. On the corner of the doctor's immense desk sat a small, ornate silver box. Inside, visible for a brief moment as the doctor gestured, was not snuff or sweets, but a collection of tiny, meticulously crafted clockwork mechanisms, gears and springs, no bigger than a thumbnail. The doctor, it appeared, had a secret hobby. The canary, the blue paint, the cheap cheroot, the clockwork. For tiny, seemingly unrelated, and utterly bizarre details. To me, they were meaningless. But in the grand, silent cathedral of Holmes's mind, these four discordant notes were beginning to resolve into a single, terrifying, and unbelievable chord. The truth was far stranger than anything we had yet imagined. Holmes's eyes snapped open. The journey was complete. He did not look triumphant, but profoundly weary, as if he had just witnessed something deeply unsettling. "Watson," he said, his voice a low, almost hollow, whisper, "we have been fools. We have been trying to solve a murder, when we should have been observing a magic trick." "A magic trick, Holmes." "A grand illusion," he declared, rising from his chair and beginning to pace, his mind now working with ferocious speed. "We have been asking the wrong question. We have been asking who killed Alaric Blackwood. The question we should have been asking is, was Alaric Blackwood killed at all?" I stared at him, utterly bewildered. "But the poison, the letter, the locked vault, smoke and mirrors, Watson, all of it," he countered. "Now, listen, and do not interrupt. Let us assemble the facts as they truly are." He picked up a pen and began to sketch on a piece of foolscap, connecting the four bizarre clues he had unearthed in his palace. "First, the clockwork," he began. "Dr. Finch is not just a physician, he is a master of miniature mechanics. He possesses the skill to create a complex, timed device. Second, the cheap cheroot. Julian Blackwood's alibi is not as solid as it seems. One of his witnesses is not a gentleman of leisure, but likely a hired hand, a man from the docks, paid to lie. Julian's alibi, therefore, is a fabrication. Third, the blue paint on Eleanor Vance's handbag. What is the one place in the city where one would find that specific shade of azure paint, combined with exquisitely carved wood? The workshop of a toy maker, Watson, a craftsman of decorative objects, like, for instance, a wooden canary. And finally, the canary itself, a warning symbol. But a warning against what? Not murder. A warning against an invisible threat. And what is the one threat that a mechanical bird, a clockwork canary, could possibly detect? He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes blazing. Not poison, Watson. Gas. A simple, common, and flammable substance. The kind used to light our very lamps. He connected the final lines on his paper. The picture it formed was insane, unbelievable, yet it was the only solution that fit every single fact. Alaric Blackwood did not die from cyanide, Holmes stated, his voice ringing with the force of absolute certainty. He was not the victim of a murder. He was the perpetrator of an attempted mass murder. And the victim in that vault was not him at all. The case had not just been turned on its head. It had been turned inside out. We were not solving a murder. We were uncovering a plot of such monstrous ambition and diabolical ingenuity that it took my breath away that I could only stare at Holmes, speechless. Not Blackwood in the vault, but the body, the police. The police saw what they were meant to see. Holmes interrupted, his energy now boundless as he laid out the entire, breathtaking conspiracy. Alaric Blackwood, a man consumed by paranoia, did not fear an enemy walking through steel. He feared the world itself, a world he believed had wronged him. His letter was not a cry for help. It was the opening act of his final, grand performance. He began to connect the pieces with devastating logic. For the past month, Blackwood was not meeting his niece for prayer. He was meeting her to collect his tools. Eleanor Vance, the pious zealot, was so blinded by her ideology and desire for the Blackwood fortune to fund her causes that she became his willing, if perhaps unwitting, accomplice. She was his courier, using her respectable status to procure items for him without raising suspicion. She was the one who visited the toy maker to order the canaries, hence the paint on her bag. She was the one who supplied him with the components he needed. But for what purpose? I asked. For a monstrous purpose, Holmes replied grimly. Blackwood intended to murder his entire family and his closest confidant in one fell swoop, and to do so in a way that would cement his legacy as an unsolvable mystery. He planned to release a massive, concentrated cloud of flammable coal gas into the mansion's ventilation system during the reading of his will, when all the heirs would be gathered in the library directly above the vault. A single, time spark would have incinerated them all, a tragedy that would be blamed on a faulty gas main. The clockwork canary was the key. Holmes continued. It was not a trinket. It was a brilliant, diabolical machine. Dr. Finch, the master mechanic, had designed it for Blackwood years ago, believing it was a simple novelty. But Blackwood had repurposed it. The bird contained a tiny clockwork motor, a flint, and a striker. It was a timed detonator. Blackwood's plan was to set the timer, leave the canary in the library, and then descend to his vault to create the perfect alibi for himself, a man safely locked away while his heirs were consumed by fire. Then who is the man in the vault? I whispered, horrified. Ah, that is the masterstroke, Holmes said. Blackwood needed a body, a substitute, to complete his illusion of suicide. And who better than a desperate man with gambling debts, a man who frequented the docks and smoked cheap cheroots? Julian Blackwood was not just an heir, he was a co-conspirator. His role was to procure a victim, a nameless vagrant from the London slums whose disappearance would never be noticed. The plan was simple. Julian would lure the man to the mansion, Blackwood would poison him with cyanide inside the vault, set the time detonator, and then lock the vault from the inside, making his escape through the secret garden door just moments before the time lock engaged at 8 p.m. Julian's unbreakable alibi was not to cover for the time of death, but to cover for the time he was delivering the victim. The sheer, cold-blooded evil of the plot was staggering. It was a symphony of greed, paranoia, and twisted genius. A father figure planning to incinerate his family, a niece acting as a holy courier for a bomb, and a nephew supplying a human sacrifice, all for the sake of a fortune. An astonishing plot, Holmes, I said, my mind still reeling from the sheer audacity of it. A perfect, self-contained crime. But it failed. The bomb never detonated. The heirs are all still alive. What went wrong? Ah, Watson, Holmes replied, a grim, almost admiring, light in his eyes. That is the final, beautiful twist in this sordid tale. The plot failed because there was a fourth conspirator, one that Alaric Blackwood, in all his paranoid genius, never accounted for. A fourth conspirator. Indeed, Holmes confirmed. The one man who stood to gain the most, not from the success of the plot, but from its failure. The one man who possessed the intelligence to understand the entire mechanism, the access to sabotage it, and the cold-blooded nerve to betray his own master. He began to connect the final, damning threads. The detonator was a piece of brilliant clockwork. Who was the master of miniature mechanics? Dr. Finch. Blackwood, in his arrogance, had commissioned the novelty from the very man he intended to kill, never suspecting the doctor would recognize his own handiwork when he saw it again. The poisoned diary was the key to the betrayal, Holmes continued. It was never meant for us, Watson. It was a plant, a piece of theatrical misdirection. After the body was discovered, Eleanor Vance, following her uncle's instructions, was meant to present the diary to the authorities. But Dr. Finch, as the executor of the will, intercepted it first. He knew his own life was in danger. He examined the diary, recognized the poisons from his own consultations with Blackwood, and understood the entire plot in an instant. He realized, Holmes explained, that if the plot succeeded, he would be dead. If he simply went to the police, the will might be contested, the fortune locked in litigation for years, and his hospital wing never built. But if he allowed part of the plot to proceed, if the substitute body was found, and Blackwood's suicide in a locked room was established, then the will would be executed without question. So he acted, Holmes stated, his voice a low whisper. On the night of the murder, Finch must have used his position as the trusted physician to gain access to the library, perhaps under the guise of checking on his patient. He found the clockwork canary, the detonator of his own design, and with a surgeon's precision, he made a single, tiny adjustment. He removed the flint from the striker mechanism. He disarmed the bomb. The betrayal was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Dr. Finch had allowed a man to be murdered and substituted for his master. He had allowed a false suicide to be recorded. He had allowed his co-conspirators, Julian and Eleanor, to believe their monstrous plan was still in motion, all to ensure that the will would be executed and his own inheritance secured. He had not murdered Alaric Blackwood, but he had hijacked his crime, turning it to his own, cold-blooded advantage. He was the silent, fourth player, who had won the game by simply removing one crucial piece from the board, we found Dr. Alistair Finch in the library of the Blackwood Mansion. He was calmly overseeing the cataloguing of the very manuscripts his deceased patient had intended to leave him, a picture of solemn, professional duty. The other heirs, Julian and Eleanor, were also present, their faces a mixture of impatience and suspicion. "Mr. Holmes," the doctor greeted, a cool, appraising look in his eyes. "Have you come to a conclusion?" "I have," Holmes replied, his voice ringing with authority, causing all three heirs to turn and look at him. "I have concluded that you are all, in your own ways, guilty of a conspiracy to commit mass murder." A stunned, horrified silence filled the room. Julian scoffed, but Eleanor went deathly pale. Holmes addressed them all, laying bare the entire, monstrous plot with cold, relentless detail. Alaric Blackwood's paranoid plan, Eleanor's role as the pious courier, and Julian's procurement of the human sacrifice. He described the gas, the detonator, and the intended fiery conclusion. "A brilliant, evil plan," Holmes finished, "but one that was doomed to fail, because it was betrayed, from the inside, by its most intelligent participant." He turned his full attention to Dr. Finch, whose face had become a mask of stone. "You knew, Doctor. You recognized your own clockwork artistry in the detonator. You understood the entire plot. And so you acted. You disarmed the bomb to save your own life, while allowing the initial murder and deception to proceed in order to secure your inheritance. You played a brilliant, ruthless gambit." Dr. Finch gave a slow, cold smile. "An extraordinary theory, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "A fantasy worthy of Edgar Allan Poe. But you have not a shred of proof. It is my word against that of these degenerate fools." He gestured dismissively at Julian and Eleanor. "Who would a jury believe?" "A jury believes in evidence, Doctor," Holmes countered. "And you, like so many clever men, have left one small, tangible piece behind." Holmes stepped forward to the grand fireplace. To disarm the detonator, you needed to remove the tiny piece of flint from a striker. A small, almost weightless object. What does one do with such an incriminating object in a moment of haste? You cannot pocket it. It might be found. You must dispose of it immediately and irrevocably. Holmes knelt before the fireplace. The grate was swept this morning by the staff, but they only sweep the surface. He reached deep into the back of the hearth, into the thick, settled layer of old ash and soot that had not been disturbed for months. His fingers sifted through the fine, grey powder. And then he stood up, his hand closed. "You tossed it into the fireplace, Doctor, believing it would be lost forever in the ash." He slowly opened his hand. There, resting on his palm, stark and undeniable against the black soot, was a single, tiny, expertly shaped piece of flint. "The heart of your betrayal, Doctor," Holmes stated, his voice a low, damning whisper. "The one piece that does not belong. The silent witness to your silent treason." Dr. Finch stared at the tiny stone, and for the first time, the mask of the calm, rational physician slipped, revealing the cold, calculating opportunist beneath. The gambit was over. The confession of Dr. Alistair Finch, corroborated by the subsequent terrified admissions of Julian and Eleanor, sent a shockwave through the legal and social circles of London. The case of the sealed vault suicide was revealed to be something far darker, a failed plot of mass murder, hijacked by a cold-blooded act of treasonous self-preservation. Julian and Eleanor Vance, for their roles in the conspiracy and the initial murder, would face the gallows. Dr. Finch, the master manipulator who had killed no one yet was perhaps the most morally bankrupt of them all, would face a long, grim sentence for his conspiracy and concealment of the crime. Weeks later, as the autumn fog once again settled over Baker Street, a small crate was delivered to our rooms. I opened it to find the exquisite, brightly painted wooden canary, released from the evidence locker at Scotland Yard and sent to Holmes as a memento of the case. Holmes took the small bird, his expression thoughtful, and placed it on our mantelpiece, a splash of vibrant, cheerful colour amidst the chemical stains and scattered papers. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he mused, lighting his pipe and surrounding himself in a contemplative cloud of smoke. "We began this case with a voice from the grave, a man who cried murder. And in the end, we discovered he was the true monster. We pursued his heirs, believing them to be simple creatures of greed and ideology, only to find them collaborators in a plot of unimaginable cruelty." He gestured with his pipe towards the canary. "But the true victor, the one who won the entire, sordid game, was the man who appeared to be the most rational, the most civilized. The physician. He did not resort to passion or paranoia. He simply waited, observed, and in one small, silent act of sabotage, turned a symphony of destruction to his own immense profit. The little bird stood silent on the mantelpiece, its painted eyes seeming to watch us. It had been designed as a harbinger of a fiery apocalypse, a mechanical angel of death. But thanks to the quiet treason of its creator, it had remained silent. It serves as a fitting reminder, Holmes concluded, his voice a low murmur, that the most dangerous threats often come not with a bang, but with a whisper. And the most complex locks, the most impenetrable vaults, are nothing compared to the silent, sealed chambers of the human heart, where the darkest plots are hatched. He turned back to his chemistry set, the canary standing sentinel, a silent, wooden testament to the chilling and intricate case of the sealed vault.